I want to read part of The Courage to Heal that talks about the concept of false memories or disbelieving recovered memories, false accusations, etc. Clearly, this can be a very heavy topic for a lot of CSA survivors, especially if you have ever been disbelieved or called crazy or have just been doubted, which far too many survivors have been. So please take care of yourself. Keep in mind, you can always hit the save button if you would like to listen to this, but if today is not the right time. For context, this book was written in the 90s. There was kind of a big trend or to-do about the concept of false memories, specifically surrounding CSA in the 90s. This idea that like you would go to therapy and then your therapist would like convince you that you had CSA trauma. And I'm jumping in, and this is talking about the idea of this false memory trend that was happening in the 90s. Many survivors have spent their lives pretending the abuse didn't happen, wishing it hadn't happened, or hearing their families tell them that they're crazy. In such circumstances, it can be exceedingly difficult to accept and believe that the abuse really took place. And now, bombarded with reports of false memories, survivors may find it even harder to trust themselves. The fact that the public debate mirrors so much of the pain that survivors have known in their families makes it even more difficult. A little history. Since 1860, child abuse has been discovered and then discredited every 35 years by the most visionary clinicians of the day, each faced with the alternative of denouncing the discovery or succumbing to scorn and disgrace. That is a quote by Roland Summit. This is not the first time that survivors of child sexual abuse have been told that they were lying, misguided, vindictive, imagining it, wanting it, or just plain crazy. Early in his career, Sigmund Freud identified childhood sexual abuse as the cause of much mental and emotional illness in adulthood. By listening to his patients, which was a revolutionary idea in itself, he learned that many of the women and men he treated had been sexually traumatized. Many had initial amnesia for the trauma, but when they were able to recall the events and talk about them, their contemporary symptoms subsided. When he put forth this discovery, Freud was criticized and ridiculed by his colleagues. The book Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman also talks about this, and it frames it more as Freud was saying this was the cause of quote-unquote hysteria. Ultimately, Freud recanted and proposed instead that his patients had either fantasized the sex or had desired it. I hate when we're talking about CSA and people use the word sex. It is not sex. Thus, scientific knowledge was put on a fast train backwards, and sexually abused children and the adults they grew up to be were left bereft. But Freud is not the only pioneer whose discoveries of child abuse were rejected. Even earlier, in 1860, the French forensic physician Ambroise Tardinot, published an expose on battered children, and later one on rape and child sexual abuse. His findings were immensely denounced by his contemporaries. Also in France, Pierre Janet independently came to the same conclusions as Freud. He learned that the severe physical, mental, and emotional symptoms from which his patients suffered were caused by early trauma. He too was unsuccessful in convincing the medical profession, though he never recanted. Freud's student Sandor Ferenczi, confirmed not only that child sexual abuse could lead to severe psychological distress, but also that being listened to and comforted is healing. He spoke out on behalf of his patients until his death in 1933, yet his brilliant insights were never accepted. I believe that the P word for sex work is one of the few words that is truly throttled on this site. But hopefully you get what I'm saying, like the thing that's associated with standing on a street corner. In 1870, Josephine Butler campaigned against child P word, comparing the traffic in young girls to the slave trade. She was harassed by the London police and assaulted by the owners of brothels. Although her cause was supported by other prominent crusaders in Europe and in the US, it wasn't until 1910, so that's 40 years later, that the US Congress passed the Mann Act. forbidding the transport of women and children across state lines for sexual exploitation. In 1946, when John Caffey discovered the physical evidence of child battering by means of x-rays, people still would not accept that abuse took place. X-ray evidence. They preferred to believe in genetic bone problems rather than face the reality that these children had been beaten. It was not until 1962, with the publication of the Battered Child Syndrome, quote unquote, that child battering was finally recognized. 1962. The acknowledgement of sexual abuse has met similar, if not greater, resistance. Even when there were clear physical signs of incest, doctors refused to identify sexual abuse. Instead, they fabricated rationales such as victim promiscuity, congenital problems such as the absence of a hymen, or the consequences of excessive self-pleasure. Until the 1980s, emerging accounts of child sexual abuse were met primarily with denial, minimization, and blaming the victim. In the first 3 quarters of this century, sexual abuse was primarily considered the fault of the child. In 1907, Carl Abraham described a 9-year-old girl who had been led into the woods by a neighbor who then attempted to rape her. The child fought off the man and managed to run away. It's a pretty impressive 9-year-old. But Abraham wrote that she had, quote, allowed herself to be seduced, end quote, and had, quote, allowed him to go a long way in carrying out his purpose before she freed himself from him and ran off. It is not to be wondered at this child kept the occurrence secret, end quote. In 1937, Loretta Bender and Adam Blau wrote, these children undoubtedly do not deserve completely the cloak of innocence with which they have been endowed by moralists, social reformers, and legislators. Referring to the children's, quote, unusually charming and attractive personalities, unquote, they went on to conclude that, quote, the child might have been the actual seducer rather than the one innocently seduced, end quote. In 1953, Alfred Kinsey and fellow researchers documented the prevalence of child sexual abuse but minimized its impact. In a sample of over 1,000 women, 1 in 4 reported sexual abuse. 80% of these said they had been frightened by the encounters, but Kinsey and his colleagues discounted their accounts, writing, quote, it is difficult to understand why a child, except for its cultural conditioning, should be disturbed at having its body part between their legs touched. They went on to express that their belief that the penalties for perpetrators were overly harsh. Quote, in many instances, the law, in the course of punishing the offender, does more damage to more persons than was ever done to the individual in his illicit sexual activity, end quote. In 1962, Eugene Revich and Rosalie Weiss wrote, the majority of PDFs are harmless individuals, and their victims are usually known to be aggressive and seductive children. This is so fucking gross. And when sexual abuse was not being blamed on the victim, it was being blamed on the mother. In 1966, Noel Lustig and his colleagues said that mothers of incest victims were really the ones responsible for the abuse. Quote, while rejecting their husbands sexually and generating in them considerable sexual frustration and tension, they played conspicuous roles in the directing of the husband's sexual energies towards their daughters, end quote. Numerous authors have concluded that mothers want their daughters to take over their sexual duties. In 1979, Blair and Rita Justice concluded that by, quote, inviting the daughter to take over her role, she, meaning the mother, is suggesting that the daughter also become her mate's sexual partner, end quote. Mothers, they went on to state, were to blame for incest because they were, quote, weak, dependent, indifferent, absent, depressed, or promiscuous, end quote. In recent years, the whole family has been held accountable for the perpetrator's actions. As late as 1983, Adele Mayer wrote, quote, in father-daughter incest, the entire family is involved and each member is actively perpetuating the abuse, end quote. Interestingly, while some professionals were blaming everyone but the perpetrator, others were insisting that child sexual abuse didn't happen at all, or only very rarely. As late as the 1970s, many clinicians were still taught that incest was extremely rare, affecting only 1 in 1 million children. Considering this history, our present ability to recognize or confront child sexual abuse is nothing short of phenomenal. The advances of the past 20 years, so again, this was written in the 90s, we're talking 70s to 90s, are a direct outgrowth of the women's liberation movement that gained force in the 1970s. Women courageously spoke about rape and battering, wrote books analyzing the ways in which our society condones such violence, and worked to establish battered women's shelters and rape crisis centers. Simultaneously, a few pioneering clinicians and researchers, both men and women, were beginning to study child sexual abuse and set up models for treatment. It was from this visionary thinking and grassroots activism the current movement to end child sexual abuse was built. There is a documented history of backlash against every progressive movement to redress the rights of the disenfranchised and oppressed. No significant steps are won without it. Although the attacks on survivors of child sexual abuse are extremely upsetting, they are also an indication of the substantial social progress we have made. Our movement has attained sufficient momentum, visibility, and clout to attract such opposition. The current backlash is in direct response to the activism of survivors. It was not until survivors started challenging and changing the laws regarding the accountability of perpetrators and suing their abusers that claims of, quote, false memory syndrome, unquote, started to appear. And this denial, although it has a new name and a new face, is really the same old thing. Judith Herman, Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, explains, "For the past 20 years, women have been speaking out about sexual violence and men have been coming up with denials, evasions, and excuses. We have been told that women lie, exaggerate, and fantasize. Now we're being told that women are brainwashed. Once again, those of us who have labored for years to overcome public denial find ourselves debating victims' credibility. How many times do we have to go over the same ground?" There's more I want to read that goes over who supports the backlash, like details of the False Memory Foundation, but I'll do that in a part 2.